and welcome to the future of hate prevention. This forum will explore our current crisis of hate and how Los Angeles and California will rise to meet this challenge and protect one of the most diverse regions in the world. My name is Capri Maddox. I am the Executive Director and General Manager of the LA Civil Rights Department, and I'll be your moderator today. Our department has hosted nearly a dozen events to address hate crime prevention. And we've also launched the LA for All campaign, which is the city's largest anti-hate crime prevention public service announcement in the city's history. We're in over 17 languages and on over 4,000 locations in the city of Los Angeles. But this conversation will look to the future of this crisis and how we will address hate crimes and extremism in the years to come. Along with me today is an incredible panel of thought leaders and policymakers. Today we have California Attorney General Ron Bonta, Council Member Nithya Raman from the LA City Council, and we have Dr. David Eisenman from UCLA Health that's joining us via Zoom, and Jamana Celia Saba, the Director of Discrimination Enforcement with the LA Civil Rights Department. Well, thank you, panelists, for being here. Let's jump right into it. Attorney General Bonta, you assumed office in April of this year, and you wasted no time in taking on the issue of hate, bias, and discrimination. And you actually called in one of your reports that hate crimes and hate incidents are at all-time high, an epidemic, as you called it, in our state. Can you talk more about the data and how your office is moving forward to address this crisis that's among us, that we're dealing with now?
Absolutely. Well, thanks for being here. Honored to be here with you. Excited to have this conversation. And the data shows exactly what we said it was, that we have an epidemic when it comes to hate. We certainly know this to be true based on our own eyes and our own experiences, our own lived experiences, the anecdotes that we've seen in California and throughout the nation, and the data bears that out as well. And it shows that year over year, 2019 to 2020, 31% increase in hate crimes across the state. When it comes to certain groups that are being targeted, even higher, 87% increase when it comes to hate crimes against African American Californians. When it comes to the API community, 107% increase. So massive spikes, massive increases, certainly data to support the description and characterization as an epidemic. And to me, that means that we're in a full-on state of crisis, a full state of emergency. It's all hands on deck. Use all tools in the toolbox, invent more, because people are hurting and they need us to be there for them. No panacea. No, cure-all to address hate. Hate's been with us since our founding, and will continue to be with us in some form until we take the steps that are necessary. And solidarity, rising up, working together to address hate is not new either. And thankfully, we have a great group of people working across the state to address our hate crisis.
And you're doing a wonderful job. Thank you so much for that answer, Attorney General. I'd now like to turn to Councilmember Raman, and just to talk about the data that Attorney General Bonta shared. We've also felt it here in Los Angeles. And I just, based on that data, what the city can do and will do as it relates to working toward hate crime prevention in the days to come.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today, Capri. It's been such a pleasure to work with your department on this. And I also just wanted to say that, I think I said this in a previous event with the department when we opened your office, but it is so important to have an anchor in the city to focus on these issues. Without that, I think it's really hard to do this kind of work in a focused way, and I think I'm very grateful to have you as a partner in this, to have the department as a partner in this, and to really learn from you in how we can do better. As you said, the data that you shared, Attorney General Bonta, that's certainly been reflected here in Los Angeles. But the thing is that our data is imperfect. And one of the things that we've pushed from our council office and pushed through council motions and legislation is really to try and improve the kind of data that we have here in the city of Los Angeles. And we did this in partnership with your department, Capri, and with Jumana in particular. LAPD now gets data on hate crimes from different places. The city gets data on hate crimes from different places. Some people, when they are a victim of a hate crime, they report it to the police. There was a big push when there was, I think, a national outcry about especially anti-Asian hate, which emerged as a result of politics in the country. There was a push to do more reporting so that people knew when it was happening. And there was a push from people to say, if it happens to you, you must speak about it. And people did that in Los Angeles through 211. And then here in the city, just this May, we actually launched a hate reporting tool through 311. But all of these pieces of information are now going to different places. And so you see pretty big discrepancies in the number of hate crimes that are being reported. So the city of Los Angeles, I think, reported through LAPD 24 hate crimes this past year. But Stop AAPI Hate reported actually 245 hate crimes. That was in LA County, and LAPD's data is just for LA City, but you can see that there's a huge, huge discrepancy in that data. And so the legislation that we put forward asks the city to consolidate all of the different points of information that are coming in about hate crimes so that we can understand where to target resources, so that we know, are there certain neighborhoods that are facing more of an issue than others? Are there particular communities that are being targeted? And it can help us spend we have limited resources. How do we target those resources effectively? I think this data will really help us. So that's one thing that the city is doing, and I think it will be useful for us.
Oh, thank you so much, Council Member. And we appreciate all you're doing to protect vulnerable communities and the support for the LA Civil Rights Department on this issue. So thank you so much. Now, let's turn to Jumana Silyansaba. Jumana, you not only serve with the LA Civil Rights Department, but you have decades of experience studying hate and extremism, which is, very important for us. And I just want to know if you can tell us how you can explain the current rise in hate and what can we do to find the right solutions to address this problem.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Capri, and it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. This is a very critical topic of our time. And unfortunately, what Attorney General Bonta mentioned in terms of the data and the numbers, and certainly what Council Member Rahman mentioned in terms of the gaps that we have in data, is something that we've been struggling with. And unfortunately, over the last several years, we have been witnessing an upward trend of hate and hate crimes. But we've also been witnessing an increase in neo-Nazi white supremacist groups, transnational groups globally, but also domestically. And what we're seeing is a lot of that is perpetuated on the internet, on social media platforms. But where that rhetoric creates echo chambers, where hate and fear, and unfortunately with the COVID-19 pandemic, we also saw conspiracy theories. All of that translates into actions at the local level. Unfortunately, what those things translate into, hate crimes and hate acts that we witness in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our cities. Generally, we've come at hate crimes from a justice-involved space with prosecution, which is critically important. We need to be very serious about prosecuting hate crimes, but we also need to be equally invested in looking at preventions and how we prevent hate crimes. And I think, Attorney General, you mentioned the spirit of collaboration and standing together. I think these are very important. These are things that we continue to promote through the LA for All campaign, through the work we do with faith communities and civic leaders. And these are all important for us to strengthen our intergroup relations and to strengthen the fabric of our communities. But I think we also need to think more into the future. Where do we go from here with the complexity of what we're dealing with nationally, globally, locally, via the internet? And a lot of those solutions can really be found in sort of being creative and looking at prevention from the social domain. How do we increase the social protective factors so that young people aren't recruited and targeted? And unfortunately, we see that being targeted through even video games. And so our attention and focus really needs to be on how we can better understand hate prevention in the upstream and where we can better understand resilience and implementing a public health model and a public health approach to how we can then propel prevention of hate so that we can more deal with this complexity and hopefully start to see a downward trend of hate crimes.
Thank you so much, Jumana. You really are the expert in our operation on hate crimes and extremism, and we really appreciate your leadership. I'd like to turn now to Dr. David Eisenman and to say, in order to address this crisis, we need to know a little bit about our numbers. And however, we know that there is a disconnect when we look at the fact that not all hate crimes or hate incidents are reported. So how do we work around that?
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me here, Capri. It's an honor to be on this with the Attorney General and the Council Member and Jumana Silian-Saba. You know, we've been doing some research funded by the National Institutes of Justice, specifically on the topic of violent extremism and mass targeted attacks. And so what I know is really focused on that, but I think there's a lot of lessons from that to hate crimes, because they're obviously quite related. You know, in a lot of these violent extremism events, the perpetrator makes their intention to do this attack known beforehand, often to family members, friends, or coworkers. The information leaks out. And yet these intimates, these people who are close to them, don't know how to prevent the attack and don't come forward. And really, these delays in sharing information matter. They could probably be prevented if we could get that information early. People could help their loved ones and not allow them to watch them go onto this pathway of violence. So we interviewed over 140 members of the community, including people from all colors, all communities, all religious backgrounds, as well as law enforcement, teachers, social workers, mental health workers, to ask what could be done to improve this kind of process so that we can intercede. And we learned a few things about the obstacles to people helping out. First is, they really don't know how, when they make a report, if they were to call somebody and say, look, my son is on these websites talking hatefully and planning to do some hateful attack, and I'm really worried about him. What can I do? They don't know who to call besides law enforcement. They have some vague ideas that maybe they could talk to some hotline, but they don't really know. So getting the information out that there's a hotline is a fantastic first step. There is a recognition, we need to recognize that not all communities in Los Angeles equally trust law enforcement to come to them. Especially we find that women, that African Americans, that Latinos, that Asian Americans, that immigrants all express some concerns that the police won't respond with urgency to their reports. That if they come from a low-income community, the police won't respond. And there's even some concern that reporting a white nationalist event to the police will just make, well, that some members of the police might be involved or sympathetic to these ideologies. And whether these are true or not, we really need to address these concerns. People want to know that when they make a report, that they want to know how that information is going to be used. They want to feel it's not going to go just into some vacuum and never be heard. You know, they hear about a world, a country filled with gun violence, and they wonder, what is anyone going to do about my report about graffiti, for instance? They're worried about being a snitch. You know, they call it that, about being a snitch and about being punished by somebody for making the report. And they actually also worry about whether they themselves are making a misjudgment. Is this really violence, and in this case we might say, is this really a hate crime? You know, they're not sure if they're accurate in their assessment, and so they really need more knowledge about what is, you know, in this case, a hate crime. A lot of people are concerned maybe this is just mental illness, and calling law enforcement is the wrong thing. So there's a lot of education we need to do.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Eisman. Really appreciate that. For those that are just joining us, we are talking with California Attorney General Rob Bonta, as well as Councilmember Nithya Raman, David Eisenman, as well as Jumana Silian-Saba, about the future of hate prevention in the city of Los Angeles and beyond. Attorney General Bonta and Councilmember Nithya Raman, I have a question for both of you. As we think about the future of hate crime prevention, what are your priorities when you think of how to address hate? And I will start with you, Attorney Bonta, Attorney General Bonta.
Thank you. You know, there's so many things we can do. My view is that there's no, as I mentioned, no panacea, but anytime we can make progress, we should, and anytime we can move the needle, we must, especially in the state of crisis and state of emergency. So we started doing some of the things we could do in the California Department of Justice. We started in my second week in office a Racial Justice Bureau to call out and name racial injustice in the state of California, and to say it, and to say that we're going to stand against it in all its forms, including right now in this moment where so many are in pain, so many are hurting with hate crimes spiking. And we are working on a number of different priorities within that space, but one of them is investigating groups that are organized around the shared value of hate, and making sure that we're protecting those who would be victims to those actions of those organizations. We're working in schools with students addressing bullying, and making sure we have restorative justice practices and opportunities to learn and grow so that the hate doesn't continue to grow itself. We're working with law enforcement to properly investigate and identify hate crimes when there are hate crimes. And so there's a whole sort of continuum from prevention, and if things aren't prevented, when they become full-on hate crimes, making sure that there's accountability and oversight, that it's victim-centered, that victims are always the center of that, being provided with services to heal. And we also started our community awareness response and engagement unit in our office to be out in the community, working with community, hearing what is needed and how we can help, how we can partner. And we're working right now on a pot of funding to support groups who are on the ground, have earned the trust of communities, have a track record of fighting against hate successfully, to provide support to them so they can amplify and scale and grow their work. So a lot of different efforts in the prevention space. I think every time we can make progress, we should, and that's just our first down payment. We're going to continue to work as we learn from others throughout the state. And right now I'm in the middle of a 13 big city tour and a set of roundtables, hearing from mayors and leaders in each of these cities about some of the great work that they're doing.
Oh, that's just amazing. And as a former prosecutor, I really appreciate that you are circling hate on all sides, not only from the enforcement side, but definitely being out in the community and looking at hate where it begins. So really appreciate your leadership. You're hitting it on all sides, and I think you're making California a better place for everyone. I'd like to turn to ask the council member if she would like to add on that question.
Yeah, well, so really excited to learn about all the initiatives at the state level too, and I guess I should ask you this later, but what kind of funding can we get for the city to support our efforts is, I think, a really big question that I have, and our office is thinking about. But certainly, so you asked about prevention. I also want to talk about response, because I think that's really important. And I think Dr. Eisenman, you talked about people having skepticism about law enforcement or having fears about calling law enforcement. I think one of the things that we are trying to think about here in the city of Los Angeles is trying to offer a set of options where you can report hate crimes that are not just law enforcement. So you can use the app. You can use the app to find resources that are available to you that will not necessarily bring someone that you fear will do harm to your family into your home. And I think that's a really important thing that we're investing in. We're doing that also in the form of neighborhood kind of alternatives to 911 response programs. We have the Circle program that's launching in Venice and in Hollywood. And often when you have an incident on the street, that is when you're calling for help. And to have somebody come in who may not be armed law enforcement, but who can help guide you through that situation, I think can be also a useful resource. And these are places where there are a number of incidents happening as well. So I think those are ways in which we are supplementing the responses that the city has to this issue, ideally with victim-centered, trauma-informed responses. And I think providing additional training to LAPD as well to make sure that when they are called into situations, that they have cultural knowledge, that they're able to respond with that kind of culturally informed responses. I think that's also a really important intervention that we are working on making, that we've talked about making, that we are in discussions with LAPD about making as well. I think these are all ways in which we are trying to address this issue in terms of how we respond to it. In terms of prevention, I think a big part of the rise that we saw in hate crimes has to do with our culture, has to do with our politics, has to do with, our former president inciting hatred through his words and through his actions and through social media, transporting that across the country. And I think what I'm very grateful for here in California is that we have leadership here that doesn't stand for that. And that we are out there saying the opposite and bringing people together in community to stand together and to really say we believe that Los Angeles and California can be a place where diversity thrives, and we believe in it. And I think doing more of that is important, as in that it combats, I think, these other narratives that are leading to some of these surges as well.
Thank you so much, Councilmember. And I definitely want to echo the thanks for being here in Los Angeles, California, where we have Mayor Garcetti and our city council, and also to think on the state level where we have the Attorney General Ron Bonta to help us to make sure that we are the example, because Los Angeles is a message city. I would message center for the entire world. And I think my next question will be to Dr. Eisenman. And we've heard the Attorney General talk about the fact that this is an epidemic of hate, which is, we've all become very familiar with epidemic, pandemic in these days. So this is a public health term, the word epidemic. Can you talk to us about your public health research and how that's important to prevent hate crimes?
Yes, I think this is the right, it's more than just a metaphor to call it an epidemic. And public health is interested in epidemics of the disease kind, but it's also interested in epidemics and pandemics of other things like injuries, like hate. Hate is central. We've seen how stigma and hate has been so tied to the COVID-19 pandemic. That was already brought up. And public health has stood up and said racism is an illness in society and causes health harms and is a public health problem. So public health is nationally and locally devoted itself to being anti-racist and anti-hate. And we just need to be able to find more resources and more lift that kind of work up. I'd like to see more research on the kinds of actual primary prevention factors that Jumana mentioned. I don't think we really fully understand what are the risk factors and what are the protective factors that lead or dissuade from expressions of hate. People may feel hate, but it's those expressions of hate that really become injurious. And these risk and protective factors could be at the individual level, they can be operating within a family, they could be operating in the community, or as Councilmember Rahman just mentioned, at the societal level, for instance, in our presence, in our social media. I'd like us to be able to think about novel and creative ways to really use data. So I'm going to lift up my colleague, Chandra Ford, who's doing work at UCLA on something called Project Refocus, and is creating a crisis monitoring system to look at stigma and hate in the community. And we need these kind of real-time monitoring systems that will look at all kinds of data and where is hate and stigma occurring so we can act early. And I will also just want to say, we really do, a public health approach means dedicating resources to evaluating any program we put out there. And we need to evaluate early and often. And then we evaluate, we learn from what our evaluation tells us, we refine and adjust our programs, we re-implement them, and we evaluate again. And we have to constantly learn, and we have to constantly do tailored evaluations for different communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eisenman. Really appreciate that. And we also are big fans of Dr. Chandra Ford, who was actually the first speaker of the Civil Rights Commission. I'd like to turn now to Attorney General Bonta. The California Department of Justice has a big role when it comes to holding people accountable for these crimes. I think it is important for us to know, like, what resources are being poured into those spaces.
Well, you know, I've often said that when it comes to hate crimes in California now, and as long as they're occurring, to the victims and the communities that are being harmed, I say, I see you, I value you, and I'm here to support you and protect you. And so we're going to be victim-centered, support our victims when they're hurt, help them heal, make sure that it's in a way that's with trauma-informed care, and that there's language access and cultural awareness, and sensitivity, and that it's done right, and that we also need to hold perpetrators accountable. So we have worked with our law enforcement partners to make sure that when there is something that qualifies as a hate crime, and it's hard to reach that threshold, we know based on the law, that we really work up the cases and investigate them and identify them as potential hate crimes, gather the evidence that can show the mental state and the bias and prejudice behind the act based on a protected class that led to the event, and hold people accountable. And that doesn't mean endless sentences, and it doesn't mean you know, some of the things that we've seen that we know are broken in the criminal justice system, but accountability must occur. And that could look like different things, including restorative practices and restorative justice. But when someone is harmed, when there is an injury to a person, a community, our community, there must be healing and restoration and accountability. And so we have resources on our website, and we've issued bulletins and resources throughout the state to provide guidance to our law enforcement partners and our community partners about best practices that, one, have accountability, and two, are victim-centered and support the victims and help them heal.
Just amazing. And I love that you're talking about restorative justice as well, to make communities whole and to also educate some of the perpetrators as well. I actually have one last question, and I would like to ask all the panelists briefly to respond. We've all shared a number of ideas on, you know, how to address hate and what success would look like in 5 to 10 years is really where I'd like to start with Jumana Cillian-Saba from the LA Civil Rights Department to just, you know, talk about what success looks like in 5 to 10 years. And we'll have Jumana start. We'll hear from Dr. Eisenman, Councilmember Rahman, and then we definitely would close out with Attorney General Bonta. Jumana.
Thank you. So I think we've talked a lot about different ideas, but I think what's really most important is hate crimes and the nature of hate crimes is that they're emotional crimes. They not only impact the victim, they impact family and an entire community. But one thing that I absolutely love, and I'm so encouraged to hear, is that we're not only focused on prosecution, but also looking at sort of that spectrum, and I think, as you sort of called it, the continuum, right? Because we know hate and hateful rhetoric eventually leads to discrimination. So it's really great to see that happening at the state level. It's really great to see that the city of LA launched a Civil and Human Rights Department under your leadership, Capri, and that we do have an aspect of discrimination enforcement. These are critically important. But a lot of things I also heard in this conversation, and I certainly heard it from you, Council Member, is investing. And that is a key word. And I think if we're going to look down, you know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we need to invest in our communities. We need to invest in community-based organizations who are most well-equipped to provide services, to provide the types of culturally appropriate wraparound social services to address not only the victims, the families and the communities. And so that is going to be key for us, is how do we invest? How do we propel community-based organizations who are truly the most well-equipped? And then the last thing I'll mention is this conversation we're also having with Dr. Eisenman, and that is understanding this from a research perspective, partnering not only across government and, you know, with the city and the state and obviously the county, but how do we increase partnership with our academic partners so that we can better understand what is effective prevention, and quite frankly, one thing we haven't talked about is intervention. there is a lot that we still don't know in that space that we truly need to learn. I know we talked a bit about policies, and just so grateful for your leadership, council member, in making sure that we have access for reporting outside of just law enforcement so that we are providing accessibility. But one last thought that I'll leave, and that is, as we think of policy, how are we also thinking about policies that engages social media platforms so that we can then use those platforms in a way that brings positive results, positive outcomes? I think we're starting to have some of those conversations. I think we're starting to hold accountability. We saw some of what's coming out with Facebook and other social media platforms. Accountability is important, but there is a tool that we can leverage, and I hope that we continue to think about that, and even down the line, what does that look like for us if we were to leverage that in a positive way?
Dr. Eisman? Thank you, Jumana.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Jumana has laid out a fantastic future, and that's really important. I second it all. I mean, first of all, what would success look like in 5 or 10 years? Well, clearly reduced incidents and reduced hate crimes. But along the pathway to that, I think there's a few markers and metrics that I'd like to see also. I'd like to really see mainstreaming of the idea of hate as a public health problem, and a much wider acceptance that this is something that does not have to be. I think there's a lot of people who don't really recognize it as a problem, or say, yeah, but what can we do about it? And I think we really need to work hard against that kind of lackadaisical thinking. I'd really like to see that people feel if they make reports, that their reports would have an impact. You know, I'd like to see, I'm sure that for every one report we've heard, there are 4, 5, or 10 incidents that have not been reported. That's just the case in all kinds of injuries, in all kinds of violence research. There's no reason why hate crimes should be any different, 10-to-1 ratio of unreported crimes to crimes. So, you know, we need to feel, people need to feel they can make a difference and make an impact with their own activities against it. And then from a whole of community point of view, I think we really need a stronger and more visible whole of community response. I love that you've included public health in this. We need to include education, social services, you know, all kinds of services in this. We need to see that the anti-hate responses like restorative justice and healing are things that the whole community can access and feels important to support. So I think those are just some other metrics that I'd like to see on the way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eisman. I'm very grateful for your response and all the great work that you do. Next, I'd like to hear the answer from Councilwoman Rahman about how we can, move this forward in 5 to 10 years, and what success will look like in 5 to 10 years as it relates to fighting hate in Los Angeles.
I mean, I second everything that's been said already. I think these are great outcomes that we can hope to see. I will say that I actually think that an increase in the number of reports will actually mean success over the short term, like let's say 2 to 3 years, because I think a lot of people don't know what constitutes a hate crime, what constitutes a hate incident, what qualifies something to be reported. I think that giving people options other than law enforcement and making sure that they know about those options and making sure they understand what happens as a consequence of reporting through those venues, I think that will really help make this an issue that is more widely known, more widely understood, and more widely grappled with. But I do think that in the short term that will result in an increase in the numbers, and then hopefully over 10 years we can see a real drop in it. But I think over the short term, actually, an increase might look like success for the work that really your department is doing in our city, and for what some of the work that the state is doing as well. And then I think for me, I'd love to see Los Angeles be held up as a model city for responding to these issues. I'm an immigrant to America. I moved here when I was 6 years old. I grew up outside of Boston, and I would never have run for office there. Never. And here, I feel a sense of belonging. My background is never questioned. I have 6-year-old twins that go to school here. I never fear that they will face some of the challenges that I faced growing up. And I think for me that gives me a lot of hope about what Los Angeles can be, because I see so much in it already that inspires me and that moves me, and I hope that we can continue building on that for the future.
Really appreciate that. Just thinking about your kids is so important, and Los Angeles definitely is the message center. And I'd like to just thank you for that answer and go on to see if we can get a response from Attorney General Bonta on exactly what success looks like in 5 to 10 years when we think about hate and discrimination in California.
Mm-hmm. Right now, I think about my 12-year-old son and looking out into the future. When he's 17 or 22, I hope we'll be in a very different place, because the place we're in right now is unacceptable, and something that and you can't accept the unacceptable. We need to take action to change it. And right now we have people throughout our state who are afraid to do everyday things, to go for a walk, to go to the store, to ride on public transportation, to take their kids to school, to go to church. And constantly nagging in the back of their mind is that worry, can I be next? Will I be next? Will I be the next person targeted for a hate crime? And so I hope in 5 to 10 years that feeling is gone, and that it's dissipated, and that we've taken steps to get us closer to where I know we need to be. That in times of crisis like this, where we have collective challenge, I always think of that Martin Luther King Jr. statement from Letter from a Birmingham City Jail, our inescapable network of mutuality, our single garment of destiny, our inherent interconnectedness. And I hope there's more demonstration that we are all in this together, that we're going to rise together or not at all, and that there's no us and them, there's only us, the collective us with our beautiful diversity. And that looks like a lot of different things. It looks like not having a president who leads with words of discrimination and racism and othering and hate. And it looks like our leaders, from our president to our community leaders and everyone in between, talking about us more and we more, and how we need each other and how we're interdependent on one another. It means having our social media platforms being places not where hate is bred, but where dignity and respect and unity and solidarity is bred. It means having a system where a victim is dignified and respected, gets help, gets services in the way that they need it, whether it's in language, and action is taken, and they're not forced to relive their trauma time and time again, or worry about being retaliated against. So, and it looks like what we're talking about now, some of the things that we talk about now that we need to lay the seeds for, we should have done that by 5 or 10 years. We talk about education for our children in elementary school, ethnic studies in high school, in college curricula. Curricula in elementary school around hate and dignity and respect for one another across our differences. We should have done that by then in 5 or 10 years, and have intervention programs that work so that someone does know what to do when they have heard that someone they love or know is about to do something based on hate that will hurt others, and know how to get help. Or when a hate incident occurs, before it ever becomes a hate crime and escalates to that, how to stop it and prevent it. So everything that we're talking about now, we need to lay the groundwork today, so that in 5 to 10 years we are reaping the fruits of those investments.
Just love that answer, and just how you brought us all together, and with all the comments and the statements that were made by all of our panelists. And even here in Los Angeles, we've worked with a number of departments and entities, our mayor, our city council, even the Department of Public Works put our message out on street banners to fight hate. Through Jessica Calozo, the commissioner, helped us in that role, putting it on sanitation trucks, et cetera. And so, and even to the art was created by the Department of Cultural Affairs, for example, and the translation was done through the LA Public Library. And just thinking about, our law enforcement partners, as well as, community activists, neighborhood councils, et cetera, that have just been here, and definitely with most of us here being parents, our kids have seen more hate and discrimination in their short lifetimes than we probably have seen in all of our lifetimes, and it's up to us to make things better. So it is truly an honor to be here with all of you today, and I'd like to thank our panelists for their time and their insight today, and to thank you, our viewers, as well as our wonderful team here at Channel 35 and Mark Pamperman from our department for being a part of this live discussion. If you'd like to learn more about the LA Civil Rights Department and how to report hate, please visit civilandhumanrights.lacity.org. And remember, if you've experienced a hate crime or hate incident, or if you don't know whether it was a hate crime or incident, report it. Call 911 to reach law enforcement for active incidents, and to call 311 or 211 to report to the city or county. This is Capri Maddox. I am the Executive Director of the LA Civil Rights Department, reminding you that LA is for everyone.